They're really other motor responses for an animal, including humans, right? You can either stay put,
right,
back up, or go forward. And this is...
Yeah, well, it's useful for people to know that that's the basic platform upon which emotions are erected too, is that emotions are like signals of those action tendencies, and they are very simple. It's back up, get away, stop, or move forward. And so generally we associate positive emotion with forward movement, and that would be positive emotion that's dopaminergically mediated fundamentally.
Right.
And then the halting would be, well, it can be calmness because there's nothing to do, but it can also be the paralysis that fear induces. And then panic and retreat they're sort of on the border between anxiety and pain, I suppose. Pain responses.
Yeah, exactly right.
It's complicated
Yeah. So these three major categories, I think, encompass most, if not all, of the possible responses, as you said, and probably form the base set for all emotions. I mean, my laboratory studied this mainly in the context of fear and confrontation. And one of the reasons we started to explore this was the following. We've all heard of fight or flight or rest and digest, right? Those correspond to the alertness system and the calmness system of the autonomic nervous system in their kind of extreme forms. But what we observed in animals and then now in human studies, we published about a year ago, is that when people are confronted with an anxiety-provoking scenario, in our case, we do this with virtual reality because we need to do it in the laboratory, we find their pain point, essentially. And by pain point, I don't mean extreme fear. I mean the thing that can raise their autonomic arousal, that has them in a mode of considering different options and trying to figure out what is strategic and what they're capable of in that moment. Could be heights, could be confrontation with a predator, animal. It varies by person. But everyone has their pain point. Even Navy SEALs that we brought to the laboratory or other people from the special operations community, each and everyone has their pain point. What they do in response to that pain point is really what's interesting. And what we found was that the pause or freeze response certainly was associated with autonomic arousal, with stress and anxiety. We measure this in the brain and body. But it was the lowest anxiety response. People always think of panic, just being paralyzed in panic. That's actually the lowest anxiety response. Retreat was the next level up in terms of levels of heart rate change and levels of change within the insula of all places. We actually recorded from human insula through a partnership with neurosurgeons. And then we found that there were a subset of individuals and animals in the parallel animal work that would confront a fear, not necessarily reflexively, but after some consideration, they would lean into the challenge, essentially confront the thing that was making them feel anxious. And it turned out that response, surprisingly, was associated with the highest levels of autonomic arousal. And this gave...
Right, but that would be heart rate?
Heart rate activation and a change in what so-called gamma wave activity in the insula. We had electrodes in the insula, and what we found was that people who were willing to lean into that challenge, the insula took on essentially a change in its activity patterns, this gamma pattern. The heart rate increased, breathing increased, sweating increased. So these are all the marks of an anxiety attack. But here, if you were to just look at the behavior of the person or the animal, what you'd find is that they were marching forward toward their fear.
That's voluntary exploration.
Right.
So now you did an animal study with mice where you showed, if I remember correctly, that the mice that were showing tail flicking, which was a prodroma to that exploratory activity, showed a particular form of brain activity that if you replicated with stimulation was more potently reinforcing than sexual stimulation.
Here's where the additional surprise came in. We thought, okay, wow, well, there are animals, these mice will tail flick in response to a threat, which is essentially saying, come on, let's go, let's fight, whereas other animals would retreat. And that tail flicking paralleled with in the human studies with people being confronted with it. For someone who's scared of heights, to go through a virtual reality scenario of being up on a high beam between buildings might not sound like a big deal to the average video gamer or to you and me, but is an absolutely terrifying experience for those people. But a subset of them will just march out onto that platform, or will even explore jumping off the platform with the understanding that it's virtual, and get very scared, but they will do it. And they also show these changes in insula activity and changes in heart rate and breathing. What was interesting to us was the mouse data told us that if you stimulate the brain area that was associated with all of this, it's an area of the midline thalamus. I don't want to get down into details of structures too much, but it was a very mysterious area, not been explored much before. Had this incredible name of nucleus reunions. Why, I don't know. The neuroanatomists name these things peculiar ways, as you know. But if we were to stimulate that brain area in mice, we could convert a terrified non-confrontational mouse into a mouse that was willing to confront its fears in a healthy and adaptive way. It wasn't being foolishly running into the jaws of a predator. It was being very strategic in its confrontation. The interesting thing was, if we introduced no fear stimulus, no heights, no predator, no nothing, and we just tickle this brain area, what we found is that animals and humans love that feeling. In fact, they will work for that feeling more than they will work for other stimulation.
So I've got a bunch of questions about that. So the first is, how do you think that's related to hypothalamic dopaminergic release in the exploratory states and the psychomotor stimulative effects of drugs like cocaine and amphetamine? And then second, if you put someone in a chronic state of activating that brain area, say you did that by teaching them to approach their fears rather than to run from them, would that produce epigenetic changes that would transform them physiologically?
Both very important questions. The dopamine system is absolutely critical here. In the animal studies, we identified, because we could place tracers in the brain and measure connections, that indeed this brain area in the midline thalamus connects directly to the major hubs of dopamine release in the brain. They have names like nucleus accumbens, et cetera, ventral tegmental area. That was great, because it confirmed for us that...
So it is tapping the primary approach-related positive reward system.
That's right.
But it's a major nucleus that allows that to happen, particularly in the face of voluntary approach to feared stimuli.
That's exactly right. And, one thing about the dopamine system that's so important and also explains a lot of pathology, but also a lot of human evolution, is that we have basically one major reward system, which is the dopaminergic system. I sometimes like the analogy that, nowadays you hear about cryptocurrency, or the dollar versus the euro versus the this versus the that. There's only one currency in all of reality, actually, and it's dopamine. Whether or not it's the dollar-backed dopamine, or it's euro-backed dopamine, or Bitcoin-backed dopamine, in the end, whether or not someone has $1 billion or $2 is really that currency resides as something that's transacted in the real world, but their notion of power and potential is dopaminergic. And so too, the potential for mates, the potential for food, how much food you have, how much meat you have stored in the freezer tells you a lot about your security and well-being for you and your family, right? That is translated into a dopaminergic internal representation of how safe and secure you are, et cetera. So this system of fear versus confrontation taps directly into the dopaminergic system. And there's a beautiful set of studies that were done in the 1960s, published in the journal Science, as one of the top journals to publish in. Again, this is not work that I did, but where they gave people, human beings, the option to stimulate a number of different brain areas, just sitting in the clinic. And some brain areas would evoke feelings of drunkenness, others would evoke feelings of anger, others of sadness, others of sexual arousal. And the area that these subjects all preferred to stimulate the most, in fact, they would just sit there and lever press pretty much all day long, was this midline thalamus area. And the subjective feeling that they reported, I find this interesting and would love your thoughts on this, is one of mild frustration, anticipation of something, although they didn't know what. It's this idea, I think, that it's tapping into the dopamine system. And the dopamine system...
The dopamine system says something good is going to happen.
That's right.